Welcome back to the 2009 No Fluff Just Stuff Tour. I'm here today with Ken Sipe, one of our speakers on tour. This year Ken has a couple different talks. One is on architecture and scaling, and the other is on So You Want to Be an Architect. And I think there seems to be a lot of misconceptions about architecture. Don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole, but do want to touch base on just your thoughts and overview of what makes a good architect within an organization, that they're truly an asset to the development team as a whole. What are your thoughts there?
So obviously there's a number of schools of thought there, right? But I think predominantly there's those who think top down and those that think bottom up. And the top down folks seem to be very theoretical, very architectural council-like, coming out with specifications. They definitely add some value. There's definitely a need to have specifications. The world, the internet obviously functions because we have those standards in place. But I think in many cases over the last decade, maybe even longer, we've lost touch with the bottom-up, kind of the grassroots approach on architecture and being a little bit more pragmatic. And you're seeing a lot of that ever since maybe even the pragmatic programmer, a number of advocates in that space, where you have the top-end needs of architectural concerns that are being driven from a pragmatic stance. Even in the SOA space, which obviously had a big name over the last, 4 years or so, maybe even less than that for some people. There's a big concern when you're coming into an organization trying to solve the entire enterprise problems, in a very holistic way. And when you start to approach those concerns, if you're really solving real problems here in that space, in ways that are pragmatic, add value, the return on investment is somewhat more real and more real time, meaning more immediate, there's tremendous value there. So the architects who play this role definitely add value to their community, to their organization.
Mm-hmm. Well, what's your viewpoint or stance in terms of architects, remaining in the code as well? That's a real critical part.
One of the things we talk about, in fact, in the So You Want to Be an Architect is kind of the difference between what do people think of when they think of an ivory tower architect. And it always brings smiles to people's faces because it seems like they've either know of one or probably worked with one. And it's this element of being disconnected, and there's an element of not being held accountable for the decisions that you make, that you're not, you don't face the consequences, in fact, of those decisions. And the only way to stay real with that, the only way to understand that is really to be in the code. There's an element of kind of vitality that is maintained with either the community or with the technology itself, and real solutions that come from being in that code and knowing what's possible, because things have changed. We didn't have Groovy or Ruby, or we didn't have these dynamic languages, at least not predominantly in our space. And there's ways that we would do things differently now that an architect, that someone who's become an architect and has been an architect for 10 years, without touching the code, there's no way they can know these things. There's no way they can solve a problem in what today might be a very simple approach, as opposed to maybe a more complicated framework approach of the past.
Agreed. So what are your thoughts in terms of open source within organizations from an architectural standpoint? I know a lot of bigger companies have like architecture review committees where they will assess an open source project and have to approve it before it can actually be used company-wide. What are your thoughts there? Does that really have value? I mean, on the surface it sounds good, but then it also sounds like another bureaucracy that things can get held up and innovation gets somewhat stifled because they're slow to adopt things that can really help in terms of development.
Right. No, that is a real challenge, and different companies, frankly, have different constraints that are important to them. As an example, the Federal Reserve in St. Louis, they will use open source, but they have the same process I think you just described. They will only use it through proper review of open source, and frankly, they never use a jar that was downloaded from a web source or from another source other than them building it themselves. And for them, they feel like that adds value in trust and value in security. But I think for most organizations, oftentimes there is that challenge that you're describing. When we talk about the top-down architects that we just mentioned, standardization is where they're driving, and standardization has a negative effect on innovation. And so you have to, the real challenge, in fact, of being a really good architect is understanding the standards that you need to apply, the ones that are going to add value because they bring that common bond of the framework or the application of the system that you're building, but yet allow the ability to have this grassroots, this innovation to occur. In the day, today we probably wouldn't look at struts and go, wow, that's cool. But in its day, it was very phenomenal. And those who took advantage of that were able to have quicker time to market,
Right.
were able to really add value to their community, to their enterprise, in a way that those who refused to go open source or had to standardize on just what Sun provided at the EJB level or at the servlet level, right? They were definitely slower, usually larger teams, more bureaucracy, slower to move, and it has a very negative impact on the bottom line, frankly. So.
Yes, very true. So maybe instead of having a committee, not wanting to create another job title, but maybe bigger companies would be better served with a chief open source officer who is tasked to evaluate all open source and then get the final approval maybe from the CTO or CIO, but there's one point of contact that's, maintaining a sense of what's going on in the community, where there's real value and what they need to be focused on, and have the chance to take that all into account when, rendering a judgment. Maybe that would allow for, quicker adoption.
Sure, yeah. I never thought about that before. That's an interesting idea. Having somebody who's accountable for that activity that you described certainly makes sense. And it can't be one of those committees that I think that's where the downfall is,
right.
is having this huge committee, this process, this thing that takes too long. You need to be able to rapidly come to agreement on solutions that are well vetted, well tested, huge communities behind them with, in most cases, good documentation, and be able to have a quick time to market and innovate, right? And I think actually, a very good idea. It's a very interesting idea to have someone who's accountable for moving that ball forward, essentially, within an organization.
You've heard it here first on the No Fluff Tour. We've come up with COSO, Chief Open Source Officer. That's right. Well, hey, Ken, thanks for your time. You can catch Ken on the 2009 No Fluff Just Stuff Tour at a city near you. Come and join us. Thanks again.